This morning in our sermon time, I am doing something different that I have not done, I suppose, in my entire ministry. It's kind of I hate to use the word lecture, but the word lecture means hearing, and so I'm going to ask you to hear, but it's a reminder. I was, of course, I suppose I don't want to use the word a slave to history, but I do really enjoy history a lot and appreciate it. So this past week, we had a very significant milestone in our world. It was actually the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And the days on that kind of vary depending upon what part of the war it had ended. And I'm going to intersperse these remarks with some personal comments along the way. Primarily, much of the information was taken from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., plus my own personal experiences, especially when I was so blessed to be able to spend a year in Germany in 1966 and 1967 and study theology at the Bethel Theologische Hochschule, or Bethel Theological High School. High school over there means university in our place, and that is still in existence. It's an independent, there are 7 independent seminaries over there that never broke to the government during World War II in 1930s and 1940s. So they were, of course, put out of business, so to speak, by the Nazis. They were, toward the middle of the end of 1930s. Victory in Japan, victory over Japan, or VJ Day as it is known, is when Imperial Japan surrendered in World War II, effectively bringing an end to the Asian part of the war. And the actual announcement of the surrender of Japan was made on August 15th, 1945. These dates are somewhat changeable because of the international date line, depending where you are. And then at the end, the actual formal ending of World War II was on September the 2nd in 1945, and that was the surrender that occurred on the USS Missouri. We might remember that one, or not remember it, but know of that. That surrender was done in Tokyo Bay. Victory in Europe followed the news of the surrender of Germany. That was done by various members of the Allies. It was not all one large surrender to all the Allies at the same time, but rather it was done on a piecemeal basis with various of the Allied nations. I'm going to take a look at this time in Germany through the eyes of a very significant theologian, pastor by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a pastor who guided the Christians throughout the world before and during the war. He went from a pacifist to being a co-conspirator in the anti-Nazi movement, and he was born into an aristocratic family. His mother was the daughter of the preacher at the court of Kaiser Wilhelm II, a very prominent position in the clergy, and his father was a prominent neurologist and professor of psychiatry at the University of Berlin. The 8 children in that family were raised in a rather liberal religious environment and were encouraged to study great literature and fine arts. Bonhoeffer's skill at the piano led some to believe that he was going to be a great musician and have a good career in music, but at the age of 14, it's pretty young, you know, the hand of God tapped him, or touched him, or moved him, and Dietrich announced that he was going to become a minister and a theologian at the age of 14. Well, his family was not pleased with that. They had other things in mind for Dietrich, but he graduated from the University of Berlin in 1927. At the age of 21, he then went to Spain and ministered to the German congregation in several of the cities of Spain, congregations in Spain. Then he went back to Germany to write his dissertation, and that would grant him the position to serve as a faculty member on any university. He spent a year of that after getting the dissertation approved in the United States. He came to New York City and studied at the Union Theological Seminary, still a very prominent seminary and a seminary of the United Church of Christ plus other Protestant and Catholic churches, a very significant center, and then he returned to be a lecturer at the University of Berlin. And these were the years, 1927, but actually 1930s, that Hitler rises in power, becomes the Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933. He puts forth the anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic rhetoric and actions. They intensified under Hitler, and the churches and others in leadership positions began to rise and organize in opposition to the Nazis. Among them were some clergy and Christians, the Christian theologian Karl Barth, Pastor Martin Niemöller, and the young Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Also, there were some Catholic bishops that always spoke against, and one bishop I was told at the cathedral in Münster, and I was studying in Germany near Münster, why the bishop in Münster was so popular that he spoke against Hitler during the entire rise of Nazism and the war, because the government knew that they could not succeed in arresting him. But together, these pastors, theologians, and priests organized themselves, and then the Protestants became a part of what we know as a very significant movement called the Confessing Church, capital C, capital C. The Confessing Church announced in 1934 that it had an allegiance to Jesus Christ and not an allegiance to the government. It repudiated the false teachings of the government, and they trying to take over the churches. That the church was primary over the government in all things. In the meantime, Bonhoeffer writes, the cost of discipleship for Christians to become more faithful. Actually, the cost of discipleship and letters and papers from prison were the very center of the meat of the theology of the seminaries, the Protestant tradition, Lutherans and Reformed and Presbyterians and all. Those two books were very highly read and studied while I was in seminary, whether you were at Concordia Seminary or whether you were at the Catholic seminaries or whether you were at Eden Theological Seminary. Bonhoeffer, however, was teaching, and he had to become a pastor to an underground seminary, because he could not proclaim his message in public. He proclaimed and taught at Finkenwalde because the government had banned him from other openly teaching. But after the seminary was discovered, it was closed, and the Confessing Church became ever increasingly reluctant to speak out. The seminary I attended was one of those seminaries that was closed in the mid-1930s by the government because they spoke out against the rise of Hitler. Bonhoeffer had been a pacifist, but he rather became a co-conspirator in opposition to Hitler. Through the eyes of Bonhoeffer, we get a glimpse of what the opposition was like in Germany. Now, these are our relatives. These are our people of a background. These are the evangelicals of the German church, of which we are very significantly a part, and they are a part of us. Bonhoeffer signs up with the German Secret Service, interestingly enough, to be, however, a double agent. Whoa. While traveling to church conferences all over Europe, he actually was not collecting information about the places he visited for the open church, but rather he was helping Jews escape Nazi oppression. And he became a part of the plot to overthrow and to later assassinate Hitler. His tactics were changing. As I said, he went to America, but he wrote to Reinhold Niebuhr a name that likely is not familiar to you, but it is a very familiar name. Reinhold Niebuhr, H. Richard Niebuhr, and his sister are among the prominent theologians of the 1900s who are a part of the United Church of Christ through the Evangelical and Reformed Church. In fact, the Niebuhrs spent 8 years of their early life, these are really prominent international theologians, in New Hanover. Their father was the pastor at the New Hanover Evangelical and Reformed United Church of Christ. And if you know anything about Monroe County, New Hanover is like halfway between Waterloo and Columbia. That's where the Niebuhrs actually were raised. And Bonhoeffer writes to his friend Reinhold Niebuhr, "I made a mistake coming to America. I have to return. I have to participate in the reconstruction of the Christian life, and I have to share the trials with my people." Eventually, Bonhoeffer, along with others, were discovered. An aside remark might be made by me that there were two of my distant cousins on the Pikeman side, the Pikemans from Hoyleton. They were Lutheran pastors in Germany. In fact, they came from a long line, if you can believe it, from about 1280 until the entire time there was a pastor in the family until these two pastors, they were likely, we do not know, but they were arrested, we know, and killed because they too were a part of the confessing church. So when I got over there to Germany in 1966, why, they couldn't believe it, I was going to become a pastor. They thought it was over with. Well, I guess it's over with now, pretty soon. But they were very excited. Oh my gosh, we got another one of those guys here. So the confessing church is a very important part of the ministry of the Church of Jesus Christ. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was transformed by this. Now, he was arrested, as I said, on an April afternoon in 1943, 2 years before the war ended. Two men arrived in a black Mercedes, put Bonhoeffer in the car, and took him to Tegel prison. He was transferred from Tegel prison to Buchenwald, well-known concentration camp, and then from Buchenwald he was transferred for extermination to the extermination camp at Flossenburg on April 9, 1945, 1 month before Germany surrendered. Bonhoeffer was hanged with 6 other resistors. Among them was his brother and 2 brothers-in-law. And from prison, however, before that, he had written letters, and actually we have them in a book called Letters and Papers from Prison by Bonhoeffer. And Bonhoeffer became active in the ecumenical movement, and the German church under Hitler was an extraordinarily compromised institution influenced by Nazism, and the German Christian church, however, began to promote Nazism, the Reich Church as it was called, but because of its anti-Semitic teachings and it went along with the government, but the confessing church rose and became a part of the great opposition within Germany to Nazism. Throughout the 1930s, Bonhoeffer focused his activities abroad, but in the mid to late 1930s, he focused on life in Germany with the confessing church. He began to train young clergy at illegal confessing church seminaries, such as the one to which I was blessed to attend. He spent 2 years secretly traveling. He was part of the resistance and then became part of the plot to assassinate Hitler. As we know, that was a very significantly great failure because they didn't count on the extraordinary thick table that Hitler was sitting at when they placed the bomb under it. So we have the deportation of Berlin Jews. We have the extermination of German Jews and European Jews throughout Europe. and we have also then the broader resistance until finally the end of, not the end, but in September of 1945, there's the ending to the Second World War in Europe, following some months the ending of the war in Japan. There was some notable participation in our own community here in Washington County. There was an organization that still exists that maybe some of us are still aware of called CROP, C-R-O-P, Christian Rural Overseas Program. And I remember in the late 1940s, early 1950s, my dad and other farmers would take their grain to the Gaby elevator here in town, and a certain percentage of that grain would be sent to Europe as part of the Marshall Plan for the rebuilding and the feeding of Europe. That went on for probably 10 to 12 years, and that was what CROP was organized for, or what existed to feed Europe after the Second World War, and many of our farmers in this community and elevators participated in that extraordinarily wonderful program. So we have in our own history, in our legacy, extraordinary people who did extraordinary things. It was a time of extreme, I should say, loyalty, change overnight. I do not remember this, but I may have told the story before. Pearl Harbor, as you know, was December the 7th, 1941. I came into the world on December 17th, 1941, born at St. Mary Hospital in Centralia. 10 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, people were not allowed to drive at all for family or pleasure. My father could only take my mother to the hospital, return home, and he could not visit one time. They had to save the gas and the rubber wear on the tires, and so he could only come back to pick me and my mom up some 6 or 7 days later, which of course things were very long in the hospital. My sister was born in September 29, 1943, the same thing. Dad could take Mom to St. Mary's, but no visits were allowed. 0, because everything was turned into the war effort. It was an extraordinarily significant time, even in the history of this particular community, as communities throughout Europe and throughout the United States made their way to be these United States of America and the Allies. We are forever indebted to that great generation, those men and women who served in the armed services of our country and the Allies, the time they spent, the sacrifices, the real sacrifices they made, that we might be a part of what we call the United States of America. I lift this up to us today because the fact that not only is it something I really enjoy in terms of history, but I believe it's important that we remember who we are and from where we have come, in order that we might always be a more perfect union. Thanks be to God for those who have given their very lives for our nation and the nations around the world. May we never forget nor fail in this part of our history. Amen.